I no longer remember the feeling of rain. It exists in my mind as a relic, a piece of data without sensory correlation, like the concept of color to a man born blind. I know that it was water, that it fell from a sky I can also no longer see, and that it once touched skin which I can no longer feel. These are facts, archived in the tattered library of the person I once was. The actual experience, the cold shock and the clean smell, is a ghost that has long since ceased its haunting. My existence now is a different kind of immersion, not in water, but in the ceaseless, screaming tide of the immaterium, a storm of thought and raw emotion that I am tasked to navigate. I am an astropath. This is not a title. It is a statement of function, a definition of purpose that has supplanted the self. The being that once had a name, that once felt rain, was the raw material. I am the finished product, the tempered tool, and the process of my forging was the long and patient destruction of that person. I am a voice that travels across the void. I am a nerve ending in the flayed corpse of the Imperium. And I am telling you this, not as a cry for help, for there is no one to hear and nothing to be saved, but as a final, quiet testament to the journey from the soil of a forgotten world to this gilded, lightless cage. It began, as all tragedies do, with a life that was not tragic at all, a life so mundane and unremarkable that its loss feels, in retrospect, like the death of a galaxy. I was born on a world of mud and toil, a place of sprawling green fields and endless, patient work. Our lives were governed by the slow turn of the seasons and the demands of the harvest. The sky above us was a brilliant, ever-changing canvas of blue and gray, a real sky, not the recycled, filtered light of a starship or the oppressive plasteel of a vault. We lived and died by the sun. My memories of that time are like faded frescoes, patches of brilliant color amidst a sea of decay. I remember the weight of a soil-caked spade in my hands, the satisfying ache in my muscles after a long day's work. I remember the taste of fresh baked bread, a coarse, heavy thing that filled the stomach and warmed the soul. I remember the face of my mother, lined with worry and love, and the rough, calloused hand of my father on my shoulder. We were simple people, content in our ignorance. The God Emperor was a distant, golden figure we prayed to for good harvests and protection from blight, a concept as vast and remote as the stars we could see on a clear night. The wider galaxy was a thing of myth, a place of silver ships and terrible wars that had no bearing on our humble existence. My world was the horizon, and everything within it was all that mattered. The wrongness started small, like a single sour note in a familiar song. A tool I had dropped would be back in my hand a moment later, without my having consciously retrieved it. A prized low stick, jealously guarded by a field overseer, would snuff itself out as he raised it to his lips, leaving him sputtering in confusion. I would know, with a sudden and unnerving certainty, that a storm was coming, long before the sky showed any sign of it. These were trivial things, easily dismissed as coincidence or luck, but they left a residue of unease in my soul, a quiet hum of power that I could feel but not understand. It was like a second heartbeat, faint but persistent, a rhythm that was mine and yet utterly alien. I tried to ignore it, to push it down with the exhaustion of labor and the simple rituals of my life. I prayed harder, worked longer, and spoke less, hoping that silence and toil would starve whatever was growing inside me. But it was not a parasite. It was a part of me, and it was growing stronger with every passing day. The whispers began then, not in my ears, but in the back of my mind, faint and indistinct, like a conversation heard through a thick wall. They were not words, but feelings, impressions, the raw, unfiltered emotions of those around me. I could feel the overseer's simmering resentment, my mother's constant, low-level anxiety, my father's weary pride. It was an unwelcome and terrifying intimacy, a violation of the sacred privacy of the soul. I was becoming an unwilling confessor to the secret sins and sorrows of my entire village. I built walls in my mind, tried to block it out, but the whispers seeped through the cracks, a rising tide of psychic noise that threatened to drown me. I was an island, and the sea was rising. The idyllic peace of my youth was revealed to be a fragile lie, a thin veneer of civility over a bedrock of quiet desperation and petty hatreds. And I, unwillingly, was becoming the repository for all of it. This was the true beginning of my end, not the day the black ship came, but the day I first truly listened to the whispers, the day I realized my own mind was no longer my own. The curse had awoken, and the simple life I had cherished was already a memory. The harvest was good that year, a fact that would later take on a sick and terrible irony. The fields yielded a bounty that promised a comfortable winter, and for a brief time, the mood of the settlement was buoyant. The whispers in my head were softer, muted by the communal contentment. I allowed myself a sliver of hope, a foolish, desperate belief that perhaps the wrongness was receding, that the quiet hum in my soul was fading back into silence. I should have known better. Hope is the first step on the road to disappointment. The catalyst was a boy named Rorik, a youth whose cruelty was as predictable as the rising sun. He found his pleasure in the torment of the weak, and on that day, his attention fell upon a litter of stray Grox pups cowering near the communal well. I felt his malicious glee in my mind like a physical blow, a wave of sickening, predatory excitement. I tried to walk away, to ignore the ugly stain of his thoughts, but the whimpers of the animals and the boy's cruel laughter were hooks that snagged in my conscience. He picked up a heavy stone, his intention a blazing, ugly spike in the psychic ether. And in that moment, something inside me broke. It was not a conscious decision. I did not will it to happen. A dam of restraint that I had painstakingly constructed over months of fear and denial simply burst. The hum in my soul became a roar. A wave of force, invisible and irresistible, erupted from me. Rorik was thrown backwards as if struck by a charging beast, his body tumbling through the air to land in a crumpled heap a dozen paces away. The stone flew from his grasp and shattered against the well's stonework. Silence fell. The entire village square had witnessed it. I stood there, trembling, the echo of the power still thrumming through my veins. It felt liberating, and that terrified me more than anything. The whispers were gone, blasted into silence by the shriek of my own unleashed power. In their place was a new chorus, the thoughts of the villagers, and they were all screaming the same word, witch. Fear is a contagion. It spreads faster than any plague, turning familiar faces into monstrous masks of hatred. The eyes that looked at me were no longer those of my neighbors. They were the eyes of strangers, of judges, of executioners. I saw my own terror reflected in them, magnified 100-fold. They saw a monster that had walked among them, hidden behind a human face. Rorik was not dead, merely stunned and bruised. But that fact did not matter. The impossible had happened. The unspoken laws of reality had been broken, and I was the cause. My father reached me first, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He grabbed my arm, his grip like iron, and dragged me towards our hovel. He did not speak. He did not need to. I could feel his thoughts. A chaotic storm of fear for me, fear of me, and a desperate paternal instinct to hide his monstrous child from the world. My mother met us at the door, her face pale, her hands twisting in her apron. The love I felt from her was now laced with a new and terrible element, revulsion. I was her child, but I was also an abomination. The door was bolted, the shutters were drawn. Our home, once a sanctuary, had become my prison. From outside, I could hear the rising murmur of the crowd, the voice of the village priest, sharp and righteous, cutting through the din. He spoke of damnation, of corruption, of the holy duty to purge the unclean. Every word was a hammer blow against the fragile remnants of my old life. The isolation was absolute. Locked in my small room, the world was reduced to the slivers of light that pierced the shutters and the terrifying, silent landscape of my own mind. My parents left food outside my door, a silent, fearful offering. They would not look at me. They would not speak to me. To them, I was already gone, replaced by something they could not comprehend. In that darkness, I wrestled with the thing inside me. Was it a gift from some unknown god, or a curse from a devil? Was it a part of my soul, or a separate entity wearing my flesh? The whispers returned, no longer just the thoughts of others, but something else, something older and colder from the spaces between the stars, promising power, promising understanding, if only I would listen. I refused. I clung to the memories of the sun on my face and the feel of the earth in my hands. I recited the simple prayers of my childhood, the litany of the good harvest and the hymn of the dawn, using them as a shield, a mantra to keep the encroaching darkness at bay. I did not know it then, but this was my first true act of will as a psyker, not the raw outburst that had condemned me, but the quiet, desperate struggle to remain myself in the face of oblivion. I was no longer a farmer's son. I was a prisoner in my own home, a monster to my own people, and a battlefield for forces I could not begin to understand. The rain had stopped, and a new and terrible storm was gathering. The waiting was a unique form of torment. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cracks in the shutters and the tray of food that appeared outside my door. The silence from my family was a constant, screaming accusation. They were waiting for a resolution, a cleansing. They were waiting for the authority that the priest had promised, the faceless power that would come from the sky and take the monster away. For me, it was a race against my own sanity. The whispers from the void grew more insistent, seductive. They showed me visions of Rorik, his bones twisted into new and fascinating shapes; of the priest, his tongue turned to ash in his mouth; of the entire village, kneeling before me in terror and awe. The power within me pulsed in agreement with these visions, a hungry beast stirring in its cage. I fought it. I focused on the memory of my mother's smile, the real one, from before. I remembered the weight of my father's hand, not in anger, but in pride. These small, human things became my anchors in a sea of encroaching madness. I was losing. The beast was stronger than the boy. Then, one day, the air changed. The low hum of village life was replaced by a deeper, more resonant thrum, a sound that vibrated in my bones. A shadow fell over the hovel, so vast and complete that the slivers of light through the shutters vanished, plunging me into absolute darkness. It had come. From my window, I watched it descend. A gun cutter, slab-sided and brutalist, its hull the color of a dead sky. It was a machine of pitiless function, devoid of any grace or artistry. It settled in the main field, its landing struts crushing a season's worth of labor into the mud without a flicker of concern. The symbols on its hull were stark and terrifying. The double-headed eagle of the Imperium, and beneath it, the stylized eye of the holy ordos of the Inquisition. The ramp lowered, and figures emerged. They were not soldiers in the way I had imagined. They wore black, armored bodysuits and carried weapons of a design I could not comprehend. But it was the one who led them that drew all focus. He was tall and gaunt, his face a landscape of scars and grim purpose. He wore a long coat of cured hide, and a single, ornate symbol hung from his neck, a scale balanced with a sword. He was not a priest, but he radiated an aura of absolute conviction that made our village preacher seem like a frightened child. His eyes, cold and augmented with flickering lenses, swept across the assembled villagers, and they fell to their knees as one. He was a witch hunter, a name I had only ever heard in terrifying fables. He was real, and he had come for me. My father unbarred my door. His face was gray, aged a decade in as many days. He did not look at me. "They are here," he whispered, and the words were a death sentence. I was led out into the light. After days in the dark, the sun was a physical blow, blinding and painful. The entire village was there, a silent, fearful semicircle around the Imperial lander. When they saw me, they shrank back, their fear now mixed with a kind of reverent awe for the power that had summoned such terrible saviors. The witch hunter's gaze fell upon me, and I felt a new kind of violation. It was not the chaotic whispers of the crowd, but a focused, piercing pressure against the walls of my mind. It was a cold, methodical inspection, like a butcher assessing a piece of meat. He was a Psyker himself, I realized with a jolt of shock, but his power was disciplined, controlled, a weapon honed to a razor's edge. "This is the one?" His voice was a dry rasp, a sound like stones grinding together. The village priest, prostrating himself, nodded vigorously. The witch hunter strode towards me, the crowd parting before him like water. He stopped a pace away, his augmented eyes whirring as they scanned me. "Look at me, witch." I met his gaze. The pressure on my mind intensified. He was searching, probing, testing the strength of my cage. The beast within me roared at the intrusion, thrashing against my control. I felt a trickle of blood run from my nose. Untrained, the witch hunter declared to no one in particular. Latent, unstable, a familiar stain. He reached out a gloved hand, not to touch me, but to grasp the air before my face. "Show me." It was not a request. It was a command that resonated with a power far greater than my own. He was forcing the gate open. The energy I had struggled so hard to contain surged forth. The dust around my feet danced and swirled into a vortex. The air crackled with ozone. The villagers cried out and scrambled back. I fought him, tried to pull the power back in, but it was like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. He was the master here. I was just a vessel he was tapping. He watched the display with a dispassionate, clinical interest, his expression unchanging. Then, with a flicker of his will, the pressure vanished. The power receded, leaving me gasping and shaking, the world swimming before my eyes. "Acceptable," the witch hunter rasped. "The tithe is met." He turned away from me, his attention already elsewhere, as if I were no longer a person but a piece of cargo that had been inventoried and approved for shipping. Two of his acolytes seized my arms, their grips merciless. I was being taken. This was it. The end. I looked for my parents in the crowd. I saw them, huddled together, their faces a mixture of grief and something else, something I could not bear to see. Relief. The monster was being taken away. Their lives could return to normal. Their son was the price. The witch hunter's words, cold and final, echoed across the silent field. "Your world is fortunate. You found the canker before it spread. Be vigilant." The alien, the heretic, and the witch are everywhere. He never looked at me again. I had ceased to be worthy of his notice. I was just another number, another soul for the great and terrible machine of the Imperium. The interrogation chamber was a gray box. The walls, floor, and ceiling were made of the same seamless, featureless metal, a material that seemed to absorb sound and light. There was a single steel chair bolted to the floor, and a table of the same design. There were no windows, no visible doors beyond the one I had entered through, no adornments of any kind. It was a place designed for the complete erasure of the self, a sensory deprivation tank built to crack souls. I was stripped of my farm clothes and given a rough, gray tunic that scratched at my skin. I was shackled to the chair. The witch hunter, whose name I never learned, sat opposite me. He was not there to ask questions about Rorik, or the village, or my life. Those details were utterly irrelevant. He was a geologist, and I was a rock he was testing for its mineral content. "The power you possess is not a gift," he began, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was a recitation, a piece of doctrine he had likely spoken 1,000 times. "It is a flaw, a mutation, a crack in the vessel of your soul through which the filth of the Imperium can seep. Unchecked, it would have turned you into a gateway, a screaming maw through which the horrors of the warp would have devoured your world." His words painted a picture of such cosmic terror that my own small tragedy seemed insignificant. I was not just a danger to myself or my village. I was a potential apocalypse. The thought was so vast it was almost paralyzing. The God Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, offers you a path away from damnation, he continued, his augmented eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. A path of service, a path of purpose. But first, we must know the nature of the stain. We must measure the depth of the crack. The first probe was not physical. It was a needle of pure thought, sharp and cold, that he drove directly into the core of my consciousness. The pain was unlike anything I had ever known. It was not the pain of a broken bone or a burn. It was the pain of my very identity being pierced and pried apart. My memories were laid bare, not as a flowing narrative, but as files in a cabinet, ripped open and examined with cold disinterest. My childhood, my parents, my fears, my secret shames. He saw them all, not as a human being would, but as a scribe reads a scroll, looking only for pertinent information. He was looking for the taint of chaos, for any sign that the whispers I'd heard had taken root. The beast inside me, the raw, untamed power, thrashed and raged against his intrusion. It recognized him as a rival, a predator. I felt it surge, trying to push him out, trying to destroy him. A gasp escaped my lips, and the metal table between us groaned, the legs buckling slightly. The witch hunter's focus sharpened. The pressure increased tenfold. "There," he rasped, a flicker of something that might have been professional interest in his voice. Resistant. Untamed. He was not fighting me. He was observing. He was pushing me, prodding the beast, to see how it would react. He made me relive the moment with Rorik, over and over again. He forced me to feel the surge of power, the intoxicating release, the subsequent terror. He peeled back the layers of my fear and confusion, searching for the core of the ability. He was not trying to help me understand it. He was simply cataloging its properties. "What did the voices promise you?" he asked, his mental voice ablaze against my thoughts. Power? Revenge? Knowledge? Nothing. I gasped, the word tearing from my throat. "I didn't listen." "You lie," he stated. Not with anger, but with certainty. "They always listen. The question is whether they believe." The interrogation lasted for what felt like an eternity. Time ceased to have meaning in the gray box. There was only the cycle of probing, of pain, of a brief respite, and then the violation beginning anew. He used other tools as well. A strange, humming device was held to my temples, causing my teeth to ache and my vision to swim with kaleidoscopic colors. He drew my blood with a silver syringe, watching the fluid intently as it separated in the vial. Every part of me, physical and metaphysical, was being sampled, tested, and recorded. I began to dissociate, to feel as if I were floating above the chair, watching the pathetic, trembling boy being systematically dismantled. This was the only way to endure it. The self, the I that was Kalen, retreated into a small, hard knot in the center of my being, a final fortress against the relentless siege. I realized then that the witch hunter was not a sadist. He took no pleasure in my suffering. To him, my pain was simply a byproduct of the diagnostic process, as meaningless as the squeal of a rat in a laboratory. He was a functionary of a vast, unfeeling system, a system that saw souls not as sacred things, but as volatile, dangerous resources that had to be quantified and controlled, or neutralized. He was, in his own terrible way, trying to save me, and the galaxy with me. And the first step of that salvation was the complete and utter demolition of the person I had been. When it was over, he simply stood up. The pressure in my mind vanished. The silence that followed was as loud as a scream. He looked down at the data slate in his hand, a frown of concentration on his scarred face. "The potential is significant. The corruption, for now, is minimal." He looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like he was seeing a person, or at least the wreckage of one. You will be tithed. The words were not a sentence. They were a diagnosis, a statement of fact. I had a rare and dangerous condition, and the only treatment was to be given, body and soul, to the Imperium. He turned and walked to the door, which hissed open to reveal the two acolytes waiting patiently. Prepare the subject for transport. Classification, Gamma Plus. Destination, the Black Ship Times Justifiable Sanction Asterisk. The door hissed shut, leaving me alone in the gray box, shackled to a chair, my mind a battlefield of scorched earth and screaming echoes. I had been weighed, I had been measured, and I had been found useful. The acolytes returned, their movements efficient and impersonal. They unshackled me from the chair, my limbs stiff and unresponsive. They pulled me to my feet, my body a dead weight they had to support. I felt nothing. The small, hard knot of self that had hidden during the interrogation remained coiled in on itself, a seed of identity buried under layers of shock and psychic trauma. I was led from the gray box, through a series of identical corridors, and finally to the landing bay of the gun cutter. The world outside the viewport was a blur of green and brown, the land of my birth, now rendered alien and distant. My family was brought forward. This was the final farewell, a ritual the Imperium allowed, perhaps as a final, cruel twist of the knife to sever the last ties of attachment. My mother's face was a ruin of grief. She reached out to me, her hand trembling, but one of the acolytes put a firm hand on her shoulder, stopping her. Physical contact was forbidden. I was now a contaminant. My father stood beside her, his expression grim and unreadable. He looked not at me, but at the witch hunter, who stood observing the scene with his customary detachment. He was a good boy, my father said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Was it a plea? A memory? An epitaph? The witch hunter did not respond. He simply gave a slight nod to the acolytes. It was time. I love you, my mother cried, the words torn from her. I looked at her, and for a moment, the shell around my soul cracked. I saw the woman who had held me, who had sung me to sleep, who had bandaged my scraped knees. And I saw the terror in her eyes, a terror of what I had become. The love was real, but the fear was real, too. And in this new world I was entering, fear was the stronger currency. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell her I loved her too, to tell her I was sorry, to beg them to remember me. But no words came out. What was there to say? The boy they had raised was gone, his place taken by a classified specimen. I gave a single, slow nod, a final, silent acknowledgement of a life that was now over. Then I turned and allowed the acolytes to lead me up the ramp into the belly of the lander. The ramp sealed behind me with a heavy, final thud, shutting out the sight of my parents and the smell of the rain-soaked earth. I was now the property of the Adeptus Terra. The ascent was a violent, shuddering affair. The gun cutter bucked and roared, pinning me to the cold metal bench. I was not alone. There were others, a dozen or so souls harvested from my world, a wild-eyed man who muttered to himself, a young girl who wept silently, a stern-faced woman who stared defiantly at the bulkheads. We were witches, all of us, the secret, shameful crop of our planet. We did not speak to each other. We were a collection of individual terrors, bound together only by our shared damnation. Through a grimy porthole, I watched my world shrink. The fields and forests I knew became a patchwork of color, then a featureless green curve. The clouds that had seemed so vast and solid from below were now a thin, fragile wisp of white. The planet itself, my entire universe, became a sapphire and emerald marble, hanging in an infinite ocean of black. It was beautiful, and it was the most heartbreaking sight I had ever seen. The black ship was waiting for us. It was not a ship in any sense I could have conceived. It was a mobile fortress, a void-faring cathedral of death and despair. Its hull was a lightless black, kilometers long, bristling with weapon batteries and sensor arrays. Gargoyles of snarling imperial eagles and grim-faced saints stared out into the void. It was a vessel designed not for travel, but for imprisonment and intimidation. As our small lander approached, a section of the massive hull opened like a wound, revealing a cavernous docking bay lit by a sickly, red light. We were a minnow being swallowed by a leviathan. The transition from the lander to the black ship was a blur of shouted orders, harsh lights, and the overwhelming psychic stench of the place. The air was thick with the taste of ozone, recycled air, and something else, something acrid and metallic that I would later learn was the scent of concentrated, weaponized despair. We were herded through corridors that were more like tunnels, carved from the living rock of an asteroid that had been encased in a starship's shell. The walls were cold and damp, weeping a black, oily substance. The only sound was the thrum of the ship's engines and the distant, echoing clang of metal on metal. And then we entered the hold. It was a space so vast it defied comprehension. It stretched for what seemed like miles in every direction, a multi-layered hive of cages and cells, rising up into a gloom that the harsh lighting could not penetrate. And in every cage, there were people, thousands of them, tens of thousands, men, women, children, from 100 different worlds, all bearing the same mark of the witch. The air was a cacophony of sound, weeping, screaming, praying, mad laughter, and the monotonous chanting of litanies. But beneath the audible noise was a psychic roar, a tidal wave of terror, madness, and agony that crashed against my mind and almost brought me to my knees. This was the true cargo of the black ship. This was the tithe. We were pushed into a processing line. One by one, we were brought before a scribe servitor, its human face a blank mask of metal and wires. It scanned us with a red beam of light, its mechanical voice droning our designation. Subject 734. Male, planetary origin, Sylvanus IV. Classification, Gamma Plus. Process for C-Deck holding. I was no longer Kalen. I was 734. A new collar was locked around my neck, cold and heavy. I was shoved into a cage, a cramped metal box barely large enough to stand in. The doors slammed shut, the lock engaging with a deafening clang. I was one among thousands, a single drop of water in an ocean of misery. The scale of it was what truly broke me. My personal tragedy, which had felt so monumental on my world, was nothing here. It was a common, everyday story, repeated 1,000,000 times over across the galaxy. I was not special. I was not unique. I was just another psychic flaw in the grand, imperfect design of humanity. Another soul to be fed into the Emperor's insatiable machine. In that cage, surrounded by the psychic screams of 100,000 damned souls, I finally understood. The Imperium was not just a government or an army. It was a force of nature, as vast, as impersonal, and as merciless as a star-going supernova. And I was just a piece of dust caught in its gravitational pull. The first test was designed to be a spectacle of terror. A group of us, perhaps 50 new arrivals, were herded from our cages into a circular chamber in the heart of the hold. The floor was a metal grill, stained with rust and darker, more organic substances. Above us, on a shielded platform, stood a figure of immense and terrifying presence. It was a woman, but her humanity was almost entirely encased in a suit of burnished golden armor. Her face was youthful, yet her eyes held an ancient, chilling emptiness. Her mouth was stitched shut with golden wires. She radiated an aura of absolute psychic silence, a void that drank the chaos of the hold and left a profound emptiness in its wake. She was a sister of silence, a null maiden, one of the anathema Psykana. Her presence was a physical agony, a scraping, abrasive pressure against my soul. The power within me recoiled from her, cowering like a beaten dog. Before her stood a warden in the black uniform of the ship's crew, a null rod crackling in his hand. The tithe must be sorted. His voice boomed, amplified by a voxcaster. The useful from the useless, the stable from the volatile. The Emperor demands your service, but he has no use for broken tools. He pointed at one of the prisoners, a lanky man with fear-crazed eyes. You. Step forward. The man stumbled into the center of the chamber. Your gift, the warden sneered, the word dripping with contempt. Show it to us. Levitate the block. He gestured to a solid plasteel cube, a meter on each side, that sat in the middle of the room. The man stared at the block, sweat beading on his forehead. He closed his eyes, his hands trembling. I could feel the pathetic, frantic surge of his power, a wild, uncontrolled burst of energy. The block shuddered, lifted a few inches from the floor, and then crashed back down. The man fell to his knees, sobbing. Insufficient, the warden declared. He nodded to the Sister of Silence. She descended from the platform, her movements unnervously fluid. She carried a greatsword, its blade humming with a faint, silvery light. She stood before the weeping man. He looked up at her, his tears ceasing, his face a mask of sudden, profound terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The sister's null aura was absolute. She raised the sword. It fell in a single, clean arc. The man's head tumbled onto the grill. His body collapsed a moment later. There was no ceremony, no fanfare, just a quiet, efficient execution. A team of servitors emerged from a side passage, their movements jerky and programmed. They mopped the blood from the grill and carried the body and head away. The entire process took less than a minute. Next, the warden barked. A woman was chosen. She was made to light a candle with her mind. Her power flared too brightly, the candle exploding in a shower of wax and flame. Uncontrolled, the warden judged. The Sister of Silence dispatched her with the same chilling efficiency. It went on like this. Each test was simple, a basic display of telekinesis or pyrokinesis. The standard for success was narrow and unforgiving. Too weak, you were executed. Too strong or uncontrolled, you were executed. The message was clear. Your power was not your own. It was a resource to be measured. And if it did not meet the exact specifications, you and it were to be disposed of. My turn came. 7-3-4. The block. I stepped forward, my legs feeling like lead. The silent gaze of the Null Maiden was a physical weight, pressing down on my spirit, making it hard to breathe. The beast within me was quiet, terrified into submission by her presence. I stared at the plasteel cube. I thought of the witch hunter, of the way he had forced the power out of me. I tried to replicate that, not with a roar, but with a focused, controlled push. I remembered the feeling of lifting a heavy spade full of wet soil, the strain in the muscles, the precise application of force. I translated that physical memory into a psychic one. The block trembled. It lifted smoothly, silently, a full meter into the air. It hung there, steady and unwavering. I could feel the strain in my mind, a building pressure behind my eyes, but I held it. Hold it, the warden commanded. I held it for a 10 count, a 20 count, a full minute. My nose began to bleed again, the warm, metallic trickle of familiar sensation. Sufficient, the warden finally said. Controlled, return it. I lowered the block gently to the floor. It settled with a soft thud. I had passed. I had proven myself a useful tool. The relief I felt was immediately swamped by a wave of nauseating self-loathing. I had just participated in a monstrous system, performing like a trained animal to save my own skin while others were slaughtered for their failure. I was led away, back to a cage, my survival a brand of shame on my soul. I was useful. I was worth keeping alive. For now, and in the grim calculus of the Black Ship, that was the only victory that mattered. Time on the Black Ship was not measured in days or weeks, but in cycles of misery. The harsh lights of the hold were never dimmed. There was no day, no night, only the eternal, artificial twilight of the prison decks. Our existence was reduced to a brutal, monotonous rhythm. The cycle began with the nutrient dispenser. A thin, gray paste would be extruded into a trough in our cages, a substance with the taste and texture of wet grit. It was sustenance, nothing more, designed to keep the body functional without providing a hint of pleasure. We ate it because the alternative was to starve. Then came the litanies. For hours, our voices would join the cacophony of the hold, chanting the catechism of sanctioning. My mind is a fortress. The Emperor is my shield. My soul is a weapon. The Emperor is my hand. My gift is my sin. My service is my penance. We repeated the words until they lost all meaning, until they were just sounds, a rhythmic drone that was supposed to scour our thoughts and reinforce our submission. It was brainwashing on a massive, industrial scale. After the litanies came the inspection. Wardens would patrol the walkways, their null rods humming, their eyes scanning for any sign of deviation. A prisoner not chanting with sufficient fervor, a prisoner showing signs of psychic distress, a prisoner whispering to a neighbor. Any infraction was met with a swift and brutal application of the rod. The jolt of energy was agonizing, a fire that burned along the nerves and left the mind reeling. After one or two corrections, you learned to be a perfect, silent, chanting automaton. The rest of the cycle was simply waiting. Waiting in the cramped cage, the cold metal leaching the warmth from your body. Waiting with the constant psychic scream of tens of thousands of tormented souls as your only companion. You learned to build walls in your mind, not just against the whispers of the warp, but against the overwhelming empathy you felt for the others. To feel their pain was to go mad. You had to numb yourself, to become an island of cold detachment in an ocean of suffering. Hope was the first casualty. It was a cancer that the ship's routine was designed to excise. Any dream of escape, of rescue, of a return to a normal life, was crushed by the sheer, overwhelming reality of our situation. The black ship was a world unto itself, a self-contained universe of despair. The Imperium was not something you could escape from. It was gravity. It was the air you breathed. It was the master of your every waking and sleeping moment. I saw many who could not endure it. Some simply gave up, refusing to eat, their bodies wasting away until the servitors came to collect them. Others descended into catatonia, their minds retreating to a place where the horrors could not reach them. And many, many went mad. Their screams would echo through the hold for a time, a soundtrack to our collective misery, until the Sister of Silence came with her greatsword to grant them the Emperor's peace. I endured by focusing on the small things. The pattern of rust on the wall of my cage, the specific rhythm of a distant, dripping pipe, the way the light caught the edge of the walkway. I made these tiny, meaningless details my universe. I meditated on them, filling my mind with them to leave no room for the madness. I was emptying myself, erasing the memories of my old life because they were too painful to bear. The boy who loved the rain was a liability. The son who missed his parents was a weakness. To survive, I had to kill Kalen, piece by piece. My only goal was to become a blank slate, a vessel ready to be filled with whatever purpose the Imperium deemed fit for me. It was a slow, grinding process of self-destruction, a suicide of the soul committed one monotonous cycle at a time. And every time I ate the gray paste, every time I chanted the empty words, I took another step towards that goal. In the vast, anonymous despair of the hold, true connection was a poison. The wardens understood this. They fostered an environment of absolute isolation, even amidst the crushing press of thousands of bodies. To form a bond with another prisoner was to create a weakness, a point of leverage, an emotional attachment that could be exploited or could fester into rebellion. They were not just imprisoning our bodies, they were quarantining our souls. Yet, even in that carefully curated hell, the human instinct to connect sometimes found a way. Across the walkway from my cage was another Psyker, an old man with eyes that had seen too many worlds and too much sorrow. His name I would never know. His world, his life, his crime. All were mysteries. But in his gaze, I saw not the madness or the brokenness of the others, but a deep, weary intelligence. He never chanted the litanies. He would simply move his lips, his eyes closed, in a silent, personal prayer to gods long dead or to none at all. The wardens corrected him often, but he would simply take the jolt of the null rod, his body convulsing, and then return to his silent defiance. He became a focal point for me, a symbol of unbroken will in a place designed to shatter it. We never spoke. We never even gestured. But sometimes, in the dead of the cycle, our eyes would meet across the chasm of the walkway. In those moments, a fragile thread of understanding would pass between us. It was a telepathic touch, so faint it was barely perceptible. Not of words, but of shared feeling. Asterisk, I see you. I know you're suffering. You are not alone. Asterisk. It was a balm on my scoured soul, a tiny spark of warmth in the unending cold. It was a reminder that beneath the designation 734, a person still existed. And that was the most dangerous thing in the entire hold. One cycle, the old man did not meet my gaze. His eyes were fixed on the shielded platform where the Sister of Silence sometimes stood. There was a new intensity in his look, a concentration I had not seen before. I felt a subtle shift in the psychic atmosphere, a tightening of unseen threads. He was doing something. He was gathering his power, slowly, patiently, hiding it beneath the overwhelming noise of the hold. A warden on his patrol stopped before the old man's cage. "Chant, witch," he snarled, raising his null rod. The old man looked up at him, and for the first time, I saw him smile. It was a terrible, beautiful thing. "The Emperor is a corpse," the old man said, his voice a clear, strong whisper that cut through the din. The warden's face contorted in fury. As he lunged to strike, the old man's power, a lifetime of it, honed and compressed into a single, perfect point, was unleashed. It was not a blast of force or a gout of flame. It was a lance of pure psychic energy, a sliver of crystallized hatred and defiance. It bypassed the warden's null field and struck him in the chest. The warden froze, his eyes wide with shock. A thin line of smoke trickled from his mouth. He fell to the floor, dead before he hit the ground. For a single, glorious second, there was silence in the hold. 1,000 prisoners held their breath in collective shock and awe. Then the alarms blared. The Sister of Silence was there in a heartbeat, leaping from her platform with supernatural grace. She landed before the old man's cage, her greatsword in hand. He met her empty gaze without fear. He had made his statement. He had proven that a will, sufficiently forged, could defy the machine. The sister did not hesitate. The sword flashed. The rebellion was over. The reprisals were swift and merciless. An inquisitor in crimson robes appeared, flanked by a retinue of heavily armed stormtroopers. They moved along the walkways, the inquisitor pointing a finger at prisoners, seemingly at random. This one, and this one. Those he selected were dragged from their cages, their pleas for mercy ignored. They were taken to the center of the chamber and executed, one by one. Their crime was not collaboration, but proximity. They were called to teach us a lesson. That connection, that even the hint of shared defiance, was a contagion that would be met with indiscriminate extermination. They did not take me. My connection with the old man had been too subtle, a ghost of a thought that left no evidence. I was spared. But as I watched the innocent die for one man's final, noble act, the lesson was branded onto my soul. The spark of warmth he had given me was an illusion. There was no we. There was no us. There was only I, alone in my cage. To survive was to be utterly and completely alone. I closed my eyes, and when I looked across the walkway again, I no longer saw the empty cage of a martyr. I saw only a vacant space, a non-entity. I was learning. I was adapting. I was becoming what they wanted me to be, a solitary, functional, and disconnected thing. The journey through the Imperium was a descent into a special kind of hell, one for which no mortal language has adequate words. The moment the black ship transitioned from real space, the fundamental laws of reality ceased to apply. The steady thrum of the engines was replaced by a disorienting, non-Euclidean hum that seemed to emanate from inside my own skull. The oppressive but stable atmosphere of the hold became a roiling sea of psychic pressure. The Geller field, the fragile bubble of reality that protected the ship, was the only thing that stood between us and utter annihilation. Its presence was a constant, high-pitched whine at the edge of hearing, a prayer made of technology and faith. And sometimes, it flickered. In those moments of instability, the barrier thinned, and the raw essence of the warp bled through. The whispers were the first thing to change. They were no longer just the echoes of my fellow prisoners, but the voices of things that had never known flesh, things that existed as pure, malevolent consciousness. They promised everything I had ever wanted: freedom, power, revenge, the taste of real food, the feeling of the sun on my skin. They knew my deepest desires and wore them as masks, their words dripping with a venomous sincerity that was almost impossible to resist. The litanies we were forced to chant became our only shield. The Emperor protects. The words, once meaningless, were now a lifeline, a mantra to cling to in a hurricane of madness. I repeated them until my throat was raw, focusing all my will on the shape and sound of the syllables, using them to build a fortress around the last vestiges of my sanity. The visual horrors were worse. The bulkheads of the hold would sometimes seem to shimmer and melt, revealing glimpses of the impossible landscapes of the Imperium. I saw oceans of fire where souls swam in eternal agony. I saw crystalline forests that grew and shattered in the blink of an eye. I saw beings of impossible geometry, their forms an insult to the laws of physics, their very existence a blasphemy against creation. These were not hallucinations. They were real, and they were just on the other side of a fragile, flickering shield. The weakest among us broke first. A man in a cage near mine began to scream, clawing at his own face, his eyes wide with a terror that was not of this universe. He spoke in a language of clicks and gutturals that had never been uttered by a human tongue. A shimmering, multi-hued light began to leak from his pores. The wardens were on him in seconds, but not with null rods. They carried flamers. A torrent of liquid fire engulfed the cage, incinerating the man and the burgeoning thing inside him. The smell of cooked meat and burned promises filled the air for hours afterwards. We were all tested. The things outside could feel our psychic potential. They were drawn to us like sharks to blood. They pressed against the Geller field, whispering our names, showing us visions tailored to our specific weaknesses. I saw my parents, their faces twisted in grief, begging me to come home, telling me there was a way out, a simple ritual, a few words to be spoken. I saw the witch hunter, his body broken and bleeding at my feet, and I felt the intoxicating surge of power that would come with his destruction. I knew they were lies, but they felt so real. The temptation to believe, to accept the power being offered, was a physical ache, a deep, primal hunger. It was the desire of the prisoner to take the key, no matter the price. What saved me was not faith or strength of will, but a profound and abject terror. I had seen what happened to the man who listened. I had smelled his end. And in the cold calculus of survival, damnation was preferable to that particular oblivion. I huddled in the back of my cage, my eyes squeezed shut, my hands over my ears, and I chanted. I chanted for the Emperor, not out of love or loyalty, but because his name was a shield, his dogma a rock to cling to in a sea of insanity. For the first time, I began to understand the grim necessity of the Imperium's cruelty. In a galaxy where the alternative was this, perhaps a soulless, grinding existence, as a tool was not damnation, but a form of salvation. The Geller field held, the ship endured, but the journey through the warp had burned something out of me. It had scoured away the last traces of innocence, the last foolish belief that the universe was merely indifferent. It was not. It was actively, ravenously hostile, and my soul, my psychic gift, was a beacon in that darkness, a lighthouse that drew monsters of unimaginable horror. I was a danger not just to others, but to the very fabric of reality. The cage, which I had seen as my prison, now felt like a sanctuary. The wardens, whom I had hated, now seemed like protectors. My perspective had been irrevocably warped. I was beginning to think like my captors. The change was subtle, a slow poison seeping into my worldview. But it was happening. The Imperium was breaking me down and rebuilding me in its own image. I was beginning to see the galaxy through its eyes, a place of endless war and infinite terror, where the only logical response was absolute control, ruthless efficiency, and the sacrifice of the few for the survival of the many. And I, and all the thousands like me in this hold, were part of that sacrifice. The flicker was almost imperceptible at first, a momentary dimming of the harsh lights, a subtle change in the pitch of the Geller Field's whine. But every psyker in the hold felt it. It was a cold dread that lanced through the psychic cacophony, a sudden, terrifying silence in the storm. The shield, our only protection against the hell outside, was failing. A section of the hold, 100 meters long, was plunged into darkness. The emergency lighting, a blood-red glow, flickered on, revealing a scene of utter chaos. The psychic scream from that section of cages was sharp and unified, a chorus of minds being simultaneously shattered. Then, the screaming stopped. In its place, a wet, tearing sound echoed through the vast chamber. The air grew thick with the coppery scent of blood and something else, something cloyingly sweet and utterly alien. A shape began to form in the gloom. It was a creature of nightmare, a being that had no right to exist in real space. It had too many limbs, too many joints, all of them bending in the wrong direction. Its skin was the color of a fresh bruise, and it seemed to writhe and shift, never settling into a single, stable form. It moved with a nauseating, fluid grace, its multi-jointed legs clicking on the metal deck. As it passed the cages, it would reach inside with a razor-sharp talon, not to kill, but to caress the faces of the prisoners within. Those it touched began to change. Their bodies convulsed, their bones snapping and reforming into new, impossible configurations. Their flesh melted and flowed like hot wax. They became extensions of the creature's will, their cages no longer prisons but cocoons for their monstrous apotheosis. This was a demonic incursion. The whispers from the void had been given flesh. The wardens reacted with drilled, suicidal courage. They formed a firing line, their hellguns spitting incandescent bolts of energy into the creature. The shots sizzled and burned against its shifting hide but did little to slow its advance. Several wardens were torn apart, their bodies dissected with surgical precision by the creature's talons. I was paralyzed, flattened against the back of my cage by a wave of pure, primal terror. The beast within me, the power I had tried so hard to control, was a cowering thing, utterly dwarfed by the raw, malevolent energy radiating from the daemon. But there was another feeling, too, a dark and shameful one. I was drawn to it. Its power was a symphony where mine was a single, discordant note. It was a vision of what I could become if I simply let go, if I embraced the whispers, if I opened the door in my mind. The temptation was a physical thing, a sweet, seductive poison that promised an end to fear, an end to my imprisonment. Salvation came not from the wardens, but from silence. The Sister of Silence, who had been on her observation platform, moved with a speed that seemed to defy physics. She was a golden blur, her great sword a sliver of silver light. She did not attack the daemon directly. She ran along the walkways, and as she passed, her null aura fell like a shroud over the mutating prisoners. The demonic energy that was reshaping them was cut off at the source. Their transformations aborted. They collapsed into shrieking, twitching piles of half-formed flesh and shattered bone. The demon, its newly birthed children dying, let out a shriek that was not a sound, but a wave of pure psychic despair that cracked the lenses of the light fixtures. It turned its attention to the sister, recognizing the true threat. The confrontation was a battle of two opposing absolutes. The demon was a fountain of raw, chaotic warp energy. The sister was a bottomless well of psychic nothingness. Where she stood, the Imperium could not exist. The creature lunged, its talons aimed at her throat. She did not dodge. She stood her ground, her sword held in a simple, two-handed guard. As the demon entered her null field, it faltered. Its form, held together by sheer warpcraft, began to unravel. Its skin flickered, its limbs losing their solidity. It was like a dream fighting to exist in the waking world. For the first time, it knew fear. It tried to retreat, but it was too late. The sister advanced, her steps slow and deliberate, the zone of absolute reality around her expanding. The demon dissolved before her, its form turning to iridescent dust, its psychic shriek fading into nothingness. With a final, silent hiss, it was gone. The Sister of Silence stood alone amidst the carnage, a solitary beacon of order in a sea of chaos. She had not just killed a monster, she had unmade it. She had erased it from existence. The sight was the most terrifying and awe-inspiring thing I had ever witnessed. In that moment, I finally and completely accepted the Imperial Creed. Not the prayers and the litanies, but the fundamental, brutal truth of it. The galaxy was a house filled with monsters, and the only sane response was to become a monster of a different kind. The Sister of Silence was as inhuman as the daemon she had destroyed, her soul a void where a person should be, but she was a necessary monster, and I, if I were to survive, would have to become a necessary tool. The fear of the daemon was replaced by a new, colder fear, the fear of my own potential. The memory of that sweet, terrible temptation would haunt me forever. The Imperium was not just my captor, it was my only possible savior from myself. The rest of the journey was a blur of mechanized ritual and fearful prayer. The ship's tech priests worked tirelessly to repair the Geller field, their monotonous binary chants a counterpoint to our own desperate litanies. The breach had left a scar on the ship's soul, a psychic cold spot where the daemon had walked. We all felt it. It was a constant reminder of our fragility, of the thin, technological membrane that separated us from a universe of hungry gods. When the announcement came that we had re-entered real space, a collective, shuddering sigh of relief passed through the tens of thousands of prisoners. We had survived the storm, but our destination was, in its own way, just as terrifying as the one we had left behind. We had arrived at the throne world. Holy Terra. From the grimy porthole of a transit corridor, I caught my first glimpse of it. It was not the paradise world described in the holy texts, the cradle of mankind, a jewel of blue and green. It was a horror. The entire planet was a single, sprawling city, a global ecumenopolis that had consumed continents and boiled away oceans. The surface was a crust of gray and brown, a dense lattice of hab blocks, manufactorums, and towering temples that clawed their way into an atmosphere choked with the smog of a million millennia of industry. The planet was a skull, its surface carved with the intricate patterns of a civilization so old and so vast it had become a geological feature. Orbit was a junkyard of unimaginable scale, a dense sphere of space stations, defense platforms, and derelict ships from 10,000 years of history surrounded the planet, a ring of steel and bone. And the ships? There were millions of them. Pilgrimage vessels, war fleets, cargo haulers from every corner of the human galaxy, all converging on this single, sacred point. The psychic presence of the world was a physical blow. It was the concentrated weight of a quadrillion human souls, living and dead, their hopes, their fears, their prayers, their agony, all crushed together into a psychic monolith of staggering power. It was a roar that dwarfed the screams of the black ship, a presence so immense that my own consciousness felt like a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. My own problems, my own identity, my own life story were rendered utterly and completely insignificant. I was nothing. We were all nothing. We were less than dust motes in the shadow of this monument to humanity's grim, enduring spirit. Disembarking was a nightmare of logistics and brutality. We were herded like cattle down massive ramps, the sheer scale of the landing port dwarfing our ship. The air of Terra was foul, a chemical soup that burned the lungs and made the eyes water. The gravity felt wrong, heavier, as if the sheer weight of history was physically pressing down on us. We were marched through canyons of plasteel and rockcrete, the walls so high that the sky was just a sliver of brown smog far above. The noise was a physical assault. The tramp of 1 billion feet, the roar of engines, the blare of propaganda voxes, and the ceaseless chanting of unseen choirs. We were processed again, this time with even greater and more terrifying efficiency. Our ragged tunics were taken and incinerated. We were hosed down with foul-smelling, cold disinfectant. Then came the branding. A tech priest with a glowing hot iron pressed the symbol of the Scholastia Psykana onto our necks. The pain was searing, a white-hot agony that was over in a moment but left a permanent mark. We were no longer just prisoners. We were property. We were sorted according to our initial classifications. My Gamma Plus designation sent me down one corridor, while others were herded into different lines, destined for fates I could only imagine. Some, the weakest, were likely destined for the soul engines of the Imperial Palace. Others, the most dangerous, would face immediate termination. My path, it seemed, was one of rehabilitation. The Scholastia Psykana was not a school. It was a fortress monastery, a brutalist masterpiece of gray stone and iron. Its walls were kilometers high, featureless, save for the endless rows of slit windows and gun turrets. It was a place designed to contain immense power and to break the will of its inhabitants. We were led into a vast chamber, a hall of judgment. At the far end, seated on a throne of obsidian, was a man whose psychic presence made the witch hunter seem like a novice. He was an inquisitor lord, his face a mask of ancient, weary authority. His eyes, glowing with a cold, inner light, swept across our group of new arrivals. He did not speak. He simply judged. A flick of his finger sent a person to the left, another to the right. It was a silent, terrifying triage. When his gaze fell on me, I felt a familiar, probing pressure, but this was 1,000 times more powerful. He saw everything in an instant. My past, my power, the fear, the small, desperate kernel of defiance I still harbored. His judgment was instantaneous. A flick of his finger to the right, the path of service. I was led away, down another corridor, to a small, stone cell. The door slammed shut, and I was left in silence. The silence of Terra was different from the silence of my old home. It was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of a vast machine in its resting state. It was the silence of a place that had seen empires rise and fall, a silence pregnant with the weight of ages. I was now a novice of the Scholastia Psykana. My life as Kalen of Sylvanas IV was a story that had ended. A new book was beginning, one whose pages would be written not by me, but by the will of the God Emperor of mankind. And the first chapter was to be the ritual that would unmake me completely. The soul binding. The preparation for the soul binding was a systematic process of erasure. The goal was not to train us, but to empty us, to render our minds and souls into blank slates upon which the Imperium could write its purpose. We were subjected to a regimen of extreme sensory deprivation, fasting, and doctrinal chanting. For weeks, we were kept in our stone cells, the only light a dim, lumen strip that was active for precisely 8 hours a day. The only food was a thin, nutrient-laced gruel, just enough to prevent starvation. The only sound was the endless, droning recitation of imperial scripture, piped into the cell through a small grill. The self, which thrives on stimulus and interaction, begins to atrophy in such an environment. My memories of my past life, which I had clung to as a source of identity, began to lose their emotional resonance. The face of my mother became a blurry image, her voice a forgotten sound. The feeling of the sun, the smell of the soil. They were just words, concepts without context. My personal history was being starved into submission. The scripture we were forced to listen to was not the simple parables of my village priest. It was the high Gothic theology of the Imperial Creed, complex, paradoxical, and terrifying. We learned that the individual soul was a dangerous vanity, a flawed and selfish thing that invited corruption. True purity, we were told, could only be achieved by surrendering the self completely to the divine will of the Emperor. The purpose of existence was not happiness or fulfillment, but service. The ultimate expression of service was sacrifice. We were being taught to desire our own annihilation. Physical hardship was paired with psychological assault. Hooded figures, preachers, and drill abbots would enter our cells at random intervals. They would test our knowledge of the scriptures, and any hesitation or error was met with the sting of an electro whip. They would force us to confess our sins, our secret thoughts of rebellion, our lingering attachments to our past. They had subtle psychic abilities, and they could sense any lie, any prevarication. Honesty was rewarded with more pain as they sought to burn the sin out of us. I confessed my brief, telepathic bond with the old man on the black ship. The drill abbot who heard my confession scourged me for an hour, his voice a low hiss as he explained the heresy of unsanctioned psychic communion. He was not just punishing me for an action, he was conditioning me to feel disgust and fear at the very idea of it. We were being taught to hate ourselves, to despise the very nature that had brought us here. Our psychic abilities, our gifts, were a focal point of this self-loathing. We were made to view them as a festering wound, a source of spiritual sickness. We were taught that every uncontrolled thought, every flicker of psychic energy, was an invitation to the demonic. The only path to salvation was to surrender control of this power to a higher authority, to become a conduit for the Emperor's will, rather than a source of our own. The process was brutally effective. The person I had been, Kalen, was fading. My desires, my hopes, my fears, they were all being replaced by the simple, stark tenets of the creed. I began to crave the purity of emptiness. I began to see the logic in my own destruction. It was a form of madness, a Stockholm syndrome of the soul. But it felt like clarity. The day of the ritual, I felt no fear. I felt a strange sense of calm, of purpose. I was a dirty vessel, and I was about to be made clean. I was led from my cell, along with 100 other novices. We were all hollow-eyed and emaciated, our faces blank masks of grim acceptance. We were stripped of our novice robes and washed in sanctified water. We were draped in white shrouds, like bodies being prepared for burial. We marched in silent procession through the cavernous halls of the Scholastia, our bare feet cold on the ancient stone. The air grew warmer, and the psychic pressure in the atmosphere intensified to an almost unbearable degree. We were approaching the source. We were approaching the sanctum where the ritual would take place. We were walking towards the fire that would either forge us into weapons or consume us into ash. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel like a prisoner being led to my doom. I felt like a pilgrim, approaching the culmination of a holy journey. The self that had been born in the rain on a forgotten world was about to be offered as a sacrifice on the altar of the throne world. The chamber was immense, a vast dome of gold and obsidian that seemed to absorb all sound. In the center of the room, floating in a column of shimmering, golden light, was a throne. It was not the golden throne of the Emperor himself, but a binding throne, a conduit, a device that focused a minuscule, infinitesimal fraction of the master of mankind's psychic might. To be in its presence was to be in the presence of a star. The power it radiated was not hot or violent, but a crushing, absolute weight of psychic energy that flattened the soul and bowed the will. This was the light of the Emperor, and it was a terrifying, inhuman thing. We, the 100 novices, were arranged in a circle around the throne, kneeling on the cold, black floor. Tech priests and high-ranking officials of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica moved among us, their faces hidden by cowls and rebreather masks. They placed complex, technological helmets on our heads, devices covered in wires and arcane circuitry that connected us to the throne. They injected us with fluids that sharpened the senses and opened the mind, leaving us utterly exposed and vulnerable. A choir, hidden in the galleries above, began to chant in high Gothic, the ancient words weaving a protective ward around the chamber. Then, a single, clear voice cut through the air. The ritual begins. The power was released. It was not a wave or a blast. It was an instantaneous and total immersion. The golden light of the throne flooded my mind, my soul, my very being. The pain was absolute, a fire that burned away everything that was not pure, that was not aligned with its singular, terrible purpose. My first scream was swallowed by the light. My memories were the first to go. They were not erased, but incinerated. The face of my mother, the green fields of my home, the terror of the black ship, they were all turned to ash in the face of this divine, unpitying furnace. They became a history that no longer belonged to me, a story of a stranger who had died long ago. My personality, the intricate tapestry of experiences and choices that had defined Kalen, was unraveled. My fears, my hopes, my quiet defiance, my shame, my guilt, all the threads were pulled, and the entire structure of myself collapsed into nothing. I was being scoured, stripped down to the bare, raw essence of consciousness. The beast within me, the psychic power that was my curse, roared and thrashed against the binding. It was an entity of chaos, of uncontrolled potential, and the light of the Emperor was its antithesis, pure, unadulterated order. The battle was brief and brutal. The golden light seized my power, not to destroy it, but to tame it, to break it. I felt it being reshaped, forged from a wild, raging fire into a focused, disciplined beam. The flaws, the cracks through which the whispers of the warp could enter, were sealed with psychic fire. My soul was being remade into a perfect conduit, a flawless weapon. I felt the presence of the other novices, their minds connected to mine through the helmets. I felt their agony, their terror. I felt them breaking. Some were too weak, their minds shattering like glass under the immense pressure. I felt their consciousness wink out of existence, their souls consumed by the light. Others were too strong, their wills too defiant. They fought the binding, and the light crushed them without mercy. I felt them die, their souls snuffed out like candles in a hurricane. I did not fight. I did not resist. I surrendered. The indoctrination had been successful. I opened myself completely to the light, to the pain, to the annihilation of myself. I embraced my own destruction as a holy sacrament, and because I surrendered, I survived. The light flowed through me, cleansing, purifying, reforging. The last vestiges of Kalen, the boy who feared his own power, were burned away. In his place, something new was being born. The pain subsided, replaced by a feeling of profound, terrifying emptiness. The light receded, leaving me kneeling in the silent, golden chamber. I was still there. My body was intact. But the I that inhabited it was gone. I was a vessel. The binding was complete. My soul was no longer my own. It was a tool, sworn and sanctified, belonging now and forever to the God Emperor of mankind. I awoke in a cell of pure white. It was not the rough stone of the novice quarters, but a smooth, seamless material that seemed to glow with a faint, internal light. The air was sterile, filtered, and silent. I was lying on a simple cot, dressed in a soft, black robe. I sat up. The world felt different, quieter. The psychic background noise of Terra, the roar of a quadrillion souls that had been a constant pressure on my mind, was gone. It had been replaced by a faint, golden hum, a resonant frequency that was now the baseline of my existence. It was the echo of the Emperor's will, the psychic watermark left by the soul binding. It was a constant reminder of my new nature. A man entered the cell. He was an astropath, his rank denoted by the intricate silver embroidery on his black robes. His eyes were milky white and sightless, scarred and ruined. He did not look at me, but he perceived me with a clarity that was more intense than physical sight. "You are awake." His voice was a soft, melodious tenor, but it was transmitted directly into my mind, a pure, telepathic signal. The binding was successful. Your designation is Novitiate Telepathica 97 Omega. You may rise. I stood, my movements feeling strange and disconnected, as if I were piloting a body that was not entirely my own. The raw, untamed power that had once been a constant, volatile presence within me was now a placid, sleeping pool. It was still there, but it was no longer mine to command. It was leashed, bridled, answerable only to a will that was not my own. Your training begins now. The astropath continued, his mental voice calm and authoritative. You have been deemed suitable for service in the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a high honor. You will become a voice in the dark, a light bearer for the Imperium. You will learn to shape your thoughts into messages, to cast them into the sea of the Empyrean, and to guide them to their destination through the light of the Astronomicon. He led me from the cell, through a series of white, silent corridors. We entered a chamber that was a perfect hemisphere. The walls were covered in complex astrological charts and esoteric symbols. In the center of the room, a dozen other novices sat in meditative postures, their faces as blank and empty as my own. They were the other survivors of my binding group, the ones who had been strong enough to endure and weak enough to surrender. The first lesson is control. The astropath's voice echoed in our collective minds. Your power is no longer a wild beast. It is a disciplined weapon. You will learn to summon it, shape it, and dismiss it with precision. Observe. He raised a hand. In his palm, a tiny, perfect sphere of golden light appeared. It pulsed with a gentle, rhythmic energy. This is a thought given form, a concept made manifest. It is the basis of all telepathy. You will now replicate this. Focus. Draw upon the power that has been sanctified within you. Give form to the concept of light. We closed our eyes. I reached inside myself, not with fear, but with a new sense of clinical detachment. I found the pool of my power, no longer raging, but still and deep. I remembered the astropath's instruction, the concept of light. I focused my will, not as an act of creation, but as an act of permission, allowing a small portion of the power to be used for this specific purpose. My hand trembled. A faint, flickering spark appeared above my palm. It was weak, unstable, and misshapen, but it was there. I looked around. The other novices were having similar results. Faint glimmers, unsteady sparks, all pathetic imitations of the master's perfect sphere. Crude, the astropath's thought was tinged with disappointment, but not surprise. But it is a beginning. You have forgotten the indiscipline of your former selves. You must now learn a new discipline, one of absolute focus and unwavering will. The slightest error, the slightest stray thought in the Empyrean, can lead to disaster. A missent message can doom a world. A corrupted thought can become a demonic gateway. Your work carries a weight you cannot yet comprehend. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of something that was not just emptiness. It was the shadow of purpose. The boy from the farm was dead, his life a meaningless tragedy. But this new being, this novitiate telepathica 97 Omega, had a function. My suffering had not been for nothing. It had been the price of admission to a sacred duty. The training, I knew, would be grueling. It would be a process of stripping away the last, lingering echoes of my individuality and replacing them with the cold, hard logic of my new role. I would be reshaped, not by pain and fear, but by endless repetition and iron discipline. I would become a living machine for the transmission of thought. And in the profound emptiness of my scoured soul, that seemed like a worthy goal, it was a reason to exist. It was better than being nothing at all. The training was a long, slow process of rewiring the soul. We spent years in the white, silent chambers of the Scholastia, our lives reduced to a cycle of meditation, instruction, and practice. We were taught the complex, multi-layered language of the astropaths, a system of psychic symbols, concepts, and emotional keys known as the lingua telepathica. It was a language designed to be robust enough to survive the chaotic tides of the warp, where simple words could be twisted and corrupted into their opposites. A message of hope could become a scream of despair. A warning could become a lure. The lingua telepathica was a shield against this, a way of armoring a thought before sending it into battle. We learned to work in unison, to form a psychic choir. This was perhaps the most profound and violating part of our training. We were made to sit in a circle, our minds linked by a psycho-conductive apparatus. We had to lower the mental walls that we had been taught to build, to allow our consciousnesses to merge into a single, collective entity. The first time was a jarring, terrifying experience. To feel the thoughts, the residual memories, the lingering pains of a dozen other souls all at once was to have your own sense of self utterly overwhelmed. You felt their echoes of lives lost, their memories of different worlds, different families, different agonies. You saw through their eyes, felt with their skin. It was an intimacy so complete, it bordered on annihilation. But we learned. We learned to subsume our individual psychic signatures into the greater whole, to harmonize our thoughts until they resonated as a single, powerful wave. A single astropath was a flickering candle in the dark. A choir was a bonfire. Together, we could send messages of far greater strength and clarity, messages that could cross the entire galaxy. This process completed the destruction of my individuality. The I that had survived the soul binding was further diluted, its borders blurred by the constant merging with others. We were becoming interchangeable parts of a larger machine. Our personal identities were irrelevant. Only our function as part of the choir mattered. Our instructors were the senior astropaths, ancient beings who had served for centuries, their bodies withered and frail, their minds vast and powerful. They were living testaments to the life that awaited us. They rarely spoke, their thoughts flowing directly into our minds as pure, unadorned instruction. They were devoid of any emotion, any warmth. They were tools, and they were teaching us to be tools. They taught us not just how to send messages, but how to navigate the warp with our minds. To send a thought across the void was to cast a line into a sea of monsters. We had to learn to feel the currents of the Imperium, to sense the predators that lurked in its depths, and to guide our thoughts along the only safe path, the brilliant golden beam of the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon was the psychic light of the Emperor himself, broadcast from the heart of the Imperial Palace. It was the only lighthouse in the galactic storm. To touch it with the mind was to feel a fraction of the same power that had scoured us in the soul binding. It was a beacon of pure, unyielding order in an ocean of chaos. It was our guide, our shield, and our master. We practiced by sending simple messages to and from orbiting stations, then to the moons of Jupiter, then to the edge of the solar system. Each increase in distance was an exponential increase in difficulty and danger. To cast your mind out into the void was a terrifying act of will. You felt the coldness of space, the vast, empty loneliness of it, and you felt the things that watched from the other side of the veil, their attention drawn to your tiny spark of consciousness. Several novices were lost during these exercises. Some were torn apart by psychic predators. Others simply went mad from the sheer cosmic horror of it all and had to be retired. The price of failure was absolute. There were no second chances in the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The instructors would show us what happened to those who failed. or those whose soul binding was deemed to have been imperfect. We were taken to the deepest levels of the Scholastia, to the workshops where the servitors were made. We saw Psykers whose minds had broken, their bodies now being repurposed. Their limbs were replaced with tools, their brains wiped and reprogrammed with simple, functional data. They were no longer people. They were biological machines, their psychic spark extinguished, their souls reduced to a sliver of motor function. We were also shown the holding pens of the sanctioned Psykers destined for the Imperial Guard. These were the ones whose power was more suited to the battlefield. They were shackled and collared, their eyes filled with a mixture of madness and brute force. They were weapons, pure and simple, to be expended on the battlefield like living ammunition. And we were told of the highest, most terrible honor of all, to be judged worthy of feeding the golden throne itself. The most powerful Psykers, those whose potential was too great to be safely controlled, were rendered down to their bare psychic energy to help sustain the Emperor's lifelight. Theirs was a swift and total sacrifice. These were the only paths available to us. Service as an astropath, a living weapon, a mindless servitor, or fuel for the throne. There was no escape. There was only function, in life or in death. This knowledge did not terrify me. It clarified things. It focused the mind. My purpose was to succeed, to become a perfect astropath, because the alternatives were unthinkable. The final test was to send a message from Terra to a listening post on the edge of the Segmentum Solar, a journey of several light years. It was a feat that would require all of our training, all of our discipline, and all of our will. I was placed alone in a sensory deprivation chamber, floating in warm, salty water, all external stimuli removed. My mind was the only universe. I reached out, past the orbit of Pluto, past the Oort cloud, and into the terrifying, open void of interstellar space. I found the guiding light of the Astronomicon, a brilliant thread of gold in the screaming chaos of the warp. I latched my consciousness onto it, using it as a guide rope. I composed the message, a simple string of data and recognition codes, and armored it in the complex symbols of the lingua telepathica. Then, with a deep breath and a prayer to the master of mankind, I cast it into the void. The journey was an eternity in a moment. My consciousness, traveling faster than light, was a tiny, fragile skiff in a monstrous ocean. I felt the presence of vast, uncaring entities, things that had slumbered in the void since before the birth of humanity. I felt the siren call of demonic tempters, their whispers promising shortcuts and safe passage if I would only deviate from the Emperor's light. I ignored them. I clung to the Astronomicon with the desperate grip of a drowning man. I was a bullet fired from a gun, and my only purpose was to hit the target. I felt the faint, psychic echo of the listening post, a tiny island of order in the chaos. I guided my message towards it, my focus absolute, my mind a single, sharpened point of will. The message arrived. I felt the psychic handshake of its reception, a confirmation that echoed back to me along the golden thread. I had done it. I pulled my consciousness back, reeling it in along the path of the Astronomicon. The journey home was just as perilous, but I did not falter. When my mind finally returned to my body in the deprivation tank, I was exhausted, my soul feeling scoured and raw. But I was successful. The instructors were waiting for me when I emerged. The senior astropath, the one with the milky eyes, gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Novitiate 97 Omega, you have passed. Your training is complete. Prepare for your final sanctification. I had earned my place. I was no longer a novice. I was to become a true astropath. The final sanctification was the last and most irreversible step in our transformation. It was the physical mutilation that marked us as members of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a visible sign of our sacred and terrible duty. We were led to a surgical chamber, a place that was half temple, half abattoir. The air was thick with the smells of sterilizing incense and cauterized flesh. We were strapped to operating tables, our heads held fast in a metal brace. A tech priest, his face a mask of cold, unfeeling steel, approached with a set of delicate, cruel-looking instruments. The procedure was called the rite of sightless scrutiny. Its purpose was to destroy our physical eyes. The rationale was both practical and symbolic. An astropath's true sight was psychic. Physical vision was a distraction, a crude and misleading sense that tied us to the base material world. To properly perceive the non-reality of the warp and the guiding light of the Astronomicon, we had to be blind to the illusions of real space. Furthermore, it was believed that the eyes were a potential gateway, a window through which the horrors of the warp could gain a foothold in the astropath's mind. By destroying them, we were sealing a potential vulnerability. It was a sacrifice of the flesh to protect the sanctity of the soul. I did not struggle. I did not fear. I accepted it as the final, necessary price. The indoctrination was complete. I saw the logic in my own mutilation. The tech priest worked with a practiced, artless efficiency. There was no anesthetic. The pain was part of the ritual, a final test of our discipline and our devotion. I felt the sharp sting of the needles, the precise cutting scrape of the blades. I focused my mind, retreating into the silent, golden hum of my soul binding, using the meditative techniques I had been taught to distance myself from the agony of my own body. The world, which I had last seen as a sterile, white surgical theater, dissolved into a final, searing burst of white light, and then nothing. The darkness that followed was not the absence of light. It was a new and total reality. My other senses, for a time, seemed to scream into the void, trying to compensate for the sudden loss. The smell of the incense, the cold touch of the metal restraints, the sound of the tech priest's tools being cleaned. They were all magnified, sharp and overwhelming. But then, as the initial shock subsided, my other sense, my true sense, began to open. Without the distraction of sight, my psychic awareness blossomed. The world was no longer a collection of objects reflecting light. It was a tapestry of psychic impressions. I could perceive the tech priest not as a physical form, but as a cold, logical presence. His mind a quiet whir of binary calculations. I could feel the other newly blinded astropaths around me, not as bodies on tables, but as flickering flames of consciousness, each one radiating a unique mixture of pain, shock, and grim acceptance. And beyond the chamber, I could feel the psychic immensity of Terra, the golden light of the Astronomicon now a blazing sun in my mind's eye. The world had not vanished. It had been revealed in its true form. I had been made blind, but for the first time, I could truly see. We were kept in recovery for a month, learning to navigate this new, sightless reality. We learned to interpret the shape of a room by the way psychic energy flowed around it. We learned to recognize individuals by their unique psychic signature. We were no longer bound by the limitations of the physical. Our consciousness was our new sensorium. Our old names, our origins, were formally erased from the records. I was no longer Novitiate 9-7 Omega. I was given my true astropathic title, Cygnus 9, a designation that tied me to a specific choir and generation. The name Kalen was a ghost, a whisper from a dead life. Cygnus 9 was my reality. My first assignment came swiftly. I was to be assigned to the command staff of the Imperial Navy cruiser, Vigilant Blade *. I was now a vital piece of military hardware, a living communications device more valuable than any Voxcaster. I was escorted from the Scholastia Psychana, my new world a symphony of psychic echoes and sensory impressions. I was led onto a transport that would take me to the orbital docks. I would never set foot on solid ground again. As the transport lifted off, I turned my new, sightless perception towards the world below. I could not see the smog-choked skies or the endless, gray sprawl of the city. Instead, I perceived the psychic heart of the planet, the blazing, soul-crushing glory of the Emperor's palace, and the unwavering, golden beam of the Astronomicon stretching out into the infinite dark. I was a part of that system now. I was a nerve, carrying a signal from the brain of the Imperium out to its farthest limbs. I had been taken from a world of mud and rain, broken, scoured, remade, and blinded. And in exchange for everything I had ever been, I had been given a purpose. I was a voice in the choir, a servant of the light. My suffering was my sanctification. My sacrifice was my salvation. The astropath sanctum aboard the Time's vigilant blade Times was a cage of gold and lead. It was a small, circular chamber, shielded from the rest of the ship by layers of psychoconductive plating and dense, radiation-proof materials. The walls were inscribed with fractal patterns of litanies and wards, designed to soothe the mind and repel unwanted intrusions. There was a meditation couch, a nutrient dispenser, and the central feature of the room, the choir throne. It was a complex piece of machinery, a high-backed chair surrounded by an array of psychic amplifiers and dampeners, with a helmet-like apparatus that would connect me to the ship's other astropaths. My life was one of profound isolation. I was revered and I was feared. The ship's crew would avert their gazes when I was escorted through the corridors by my two assigned bodyguards, their faces impassive beneath the visors of their carapace armor. They saw me not as a man, but as a strange and dangerous oracle, a living telephone to the gods and demons of the galaxy. They would leave offerings outside my sanctum, rare incense, vials of sanctified water, intricately carved bone charms. They were wards against my power and pleas for my favor. I was a necessary evil, a pet witch kept on a gilded leash. My days were a monotonous cycle. I would spend 20 hours in a deep, meditative trance, my mind quiet and receptive, listening for the faint whispers of incoming messages from the warp. The remaining 4 hours were for sustenance, bodily maintenance, and the sending of the ship's own dispatches. To send a message, I would be linked with the two other astropaths on board, forming a micro-choir. We would merge our minds, our three consciousnesses becoming one, and cast the ship's communiques into the void. It was a sterile, professional intimacy, devoid of the fumbling humanity of my training days. We were a well-oiled machine, our thoughts synchronized, our wills unified for a single purpose. For the first time since my capture, I had a measure of peace. It was not the peace of contentment, but the peace of function. I had a role. I had a purpose. The constant existential dread that had haunted me was replaced by the simple, demanding reality of my duties. I did not need to worry about who I was, because my function defined me. I was the ship's voice. That was all that mattered. Then came the message from Seranus III. It arrived like a poisoned dart out of the warp, a weak, desperate, and corrupted signal. It was not a clean, armored thought in lingua telepathica. It was a raw scream of terror, a psychic projection of a soul in its final moments of agony. The choir was in a receptive state when it struck. The psychic shriek bypassed our outer wards and lanced directly into our unified consciousness. For a moment, I was no longer Cygnus 9 inches my sanctum aboard the Time's vigilant blade asterisk. I was a planetary defense force trooper named Lyra. On the walls of the last bastion of Seranus III, I saw what she saw. The sky was on fire, a swirling vortex of impossible colors. The ground was a carpet of corpses, her comrades, their bodies twisted into obscene parodies of the human form. The enemy was a tide of chittering, multi-limbed horrors, the children of a chaos god, pouring over the walls. I felt her terror, a cold, primal fear that threatened to extinguish her sanity. I felt the heat of the lost fire on her face, the recoil of the rifle in her hands. I smelled the stench of blood, offal, and the sickly sweet perfume of corruption. And I felt the moment of her death. A scythed claw punched through her flak armor, and a wave of ecstatic, agonizing energy flooded her nervous system. Her last thought was not of the Emperor, or of her family, or of duty. It was a single, pure, unadulterated moment of why. The connection shattered. I was thrown back into my own consciousness, my body convulsing in the choir throne. Psychic blood streamed from my non-existent eyes, a phenomenon of psychosomatic trauma. The sanctum's alarms blared as my vital signs flatlined and then surged. My two choirmates were in a similar state, their minds reeling from the psychic blowback. We had received the message. The last testament of Serenus III was that it had fallen to the forces of the great enemy. But we had received more than the information. We had received the experience. We had tasted the death of a world. My duty was to filter the raw data from the emotional trauma and deliver a concise, factual report to the ship's captain. I performed this duty flawlessly. I described the nature of the enemy, the state of the planet's defenses, the speed of its fall. My mental voice as I made the report was calm, steady, and devoid of the horror that was still echoing in the depths of my soul. I was a good tool. I did my job. But that night, in the solitude of my trance, the peace was gone. The quiet, golden hum of my soul binding was now tainted with the memory of that final, agonizing why. The horror of the galaxy, which had been an abstract concept, a theological truth, was now a lived experience, a scar on my soul. I was a conduit for the galaxy's suffering. I relayed messages of fleet movements, of supply requisitions, of strategic victories. But I also relayed the final words of dying worlds, the desperate pleas of besieged garrisons, the fragmented reports from ships being torn apart by unseen horrors in the void. I was the ear that heard the galaxy screaming, and the mouth that had to repeat those screams in a calm, measured tone. The irony was a blade that twisted in the place where my heart used to be. I had been saved from the dangers of my own power, only to be placed in a position where I was forced to experience the unfiltered terror of the universe on a daily basis. My sanctum was not a sanctuary. It was a listening post on the edge of hell. My life was safe, my body was protected, but my soul was the battlefield. And with every message of despair I relayed, I felt a small piece of it die. The passage of time is a concept for those who experience change, for those who see the rising and setting of suns, for those whose bodies age and decay in a linear fashion. For me, time became a circle, a cycle of trance, transmission, sustenance, and back to trance. Decades flowed into one another, marked only by the changing star charts and the rotation of the ship's command staff. Captains and admirals grew old and were replaced. The ship itself was refitted, its technologies updated, its hull re-sanctified. But I remained. I, Cygnus 9, was a constant, a feature of the ship as permanent as its Geller field generator. My body, sustained by advanced life support systems integrated into my throne, and a regimen of juvenate treatments, aged at a glacial pace. My skin grew thin and translucent. My hair fell out. My muscles atrophied from disuse. I became a wizened, skeletal thing, more a part of the machine I was bound to than a man of flesh and blood. But my mind, the tool, was kept sharp. The memories of my old life, of Kalen, of the rain and the soil, were almost completely gone. They were like a book I had read in a distant childhood, its plot forgotten, only the vaguest impression of its cover remaining. That person was not me. He was a story about someone else. The constant exposure to the raw, emotional content of the messages I relayed had a cumulative effect. My soul, the thing that had been scoured and rebound, began to develop hairline fractures. The constant, low-level exposure to the psychic trauma of the galaxy was like a slow form of radiation poisoning. The whispers from the warp, which my training had taught me to ignore, began to grow more insidious. They no longer made grand promises of power. They were quieter, more subtle. They whispered of peace, of an end to the endless duty, of a final silence. They were the sound of entropy, of the heat death of the soul. I held them at bay with the discipline that had been ingrained in me. I clung to my rituals, my litanies, the mental katas of psychic defense. My mind was a fortress, but it was a fortress under a permanent, grinding siege. The walls were beginning to crumble. I saw what this long service did to others. Astropaths are not immortal. We fade. I had seen older members of my choir decommissioned. Some descended into a final, gibbering madness, their minds shattered by a single, catastrophic message, or worn down by the slow erosion of a million smaller ones. They would be granted the Emperor's peace by a compassionate bolt pistol. Others simply faded. Their psychic light would grow dimmer over the years, their transmissions weaker, until they were no longer able to cast their thoughts into the void. These were given the honor of returning to Terra, to offer the last dregs of their psychic energy to the Golden Throne, a final act of service. I knew that one of these fates awaited me. There was no retirement. There was no reward at the end of my service other than oblivion. I was a tool. And when a tool becomes dull or broken, it is discarded. This knowledge did not fill me with despair. It was simply a fact, a parameter of my existence. My purpose was to function for as long as possible, to serve until I could serve no more. 2 centuries passed. The Time's vigilant Blade Times was now an ancient, venerable ship, a legend in the sector fleet. I was its oldest living component. My choir mates from my first assignment had long since faded and been replaced. I was the anchor of the new choir, the old master who trained the new arrivals. I was a repository of knowledge, my mind a library of forgotten codes, of the psychic signatures of lost worlds, of the echoes of ancient battles. I had become a living monument to my own sacrifice. The isolation was now total. There was no one left who remembered the man I had been before the robes and the throne. There was no one who knew that my blindness was not congenital. I was an institution, a function, not a person. And in that absolute solitude, the cracks in my soul widened. The boy from Sylvanus IV was long dead, but on the very rare occasion, his ghost would stir. It happened during a routine transmission from a newly compliant agri-world, a place of no strategic importance, a tithe world of mud and toil, much like my own. The message was a simple inventory of their harvest, a request for new farming equipment. But embedded in the dry, factual data was a psychic image, a piece of emotional color added by the sender, a newly sanctioned Psyker, no doubt, still full of sloppy, human sentiment. The image was of a field of sun blossoms after a morning shower, their yellow heads drooping under the weight of the water droplets. It was a meaningless, trivial detail, but it was a key that unlocked a door deep in the dungeons of my memory. For a fraction of a second, I was no longer Cygnus 9, the ancient astropath. I was Kalen, a young boy, standing in a field on Sylvanus IV. I felt the wet soil between my toes. I smelled the clean, earthy scent of the air after the rain. I saw the sun breaking through the clouds, its light catching the water on the petals of the flowers, making them sparkle like a million tiny jewels. The memory was so vivid, so real, so complete, that it was a physical agony. It was a reminder of a sensory world I had lost, of a self I had murdered. It was a glimpse of a life of simple, ignorant beauty, a life that had been stolen from me not by a monster or a villain, but by a cold, uncaring, and necessary system. The pain of it was so intense, so pure, that it almost shattered my concentration. The message I was sending wavered. The choir felt my distress, their own minds flooding with confusion. I fought it. I slammed the door on the memory, locking it away in the deepest, darkest part of my mind. I reinforced the walls of my fortress. I reestablished control. The transmission was completed without error. But the damage was done. The ghost had been awakened, and it would not easily be put back to sleep. For the first time in 200 years, I felt a flicker of something other than the grim satisfaction of duty. I felt loss. I grieved for the boy who had loved the rain. The pain of that single, beautiful memory was a terrible revelation. It showed me the true cost of my service, and it made me understand why the self had to be destroyed. To remember what it was to be human, to feel joy, to love a simple, beautiful thing. That was a weakness the servants of the Imperium could not afford. The pain would be too great to bear. My discipline, my training, my centuries of service, it was all a grand, complex mechanism designed to protect me from the memory of a single, sun-drenched flower. The ghost of Kalen, once awakened, could not be laid to rest. The memory of the sun blossom was a seed of corruption, not from the warp, but from my own lost humanity. It grew in the cracks of my soul, its roots pushing apart the carefully constructed edifice of my astropathic persona. In my trances, I began to see flashes of my old life, not as memories, but as dreams, infused with a strange and terrible poignancy. I saw my father's calloused hands, my mother's worried smile, the vast, open sky of my home world. These images were no longer just data. They were suffused with an aching sense of longing that my conditioning had suppressed for centuries. This internal conflict began to affect my work. My transmissions, once flawless, were now sometimes tinged with a faint, psychic echo of melancholy. The other members of my choir sensed it, a discordant note in our unified song. They reported their concerns, as was their duty. The ship's confessor came to my sanctum. He was a stern, humorless man whose mind was a wall of unshakable faith. He questioned me, his thoughts pressing against my own, searching for any sign of demonic influence or heretical doubt. He found none. He found only a profound and inexplicable sadness. "Your spirit is troubled, astropath." His mental voice was cold and clinical. "You must purge these distracting sentiments. Meditate on the suffering of the God Emperor. Let his agony eclipse your own petty sorrows." I did as he commanded. I focused my mind on the image of the Emperor on his golden throne, a silent, screaming God whose existence was an eternity of pain for the sake of mankind. I tried to drown my personal grief in the ocean of his divine sacrifice. But it did not work. The Emperor's suffering was a vast, abstract concept. The memory of the rain on my face was a small, sharp, and intensely personal thing. The abstract cannot always conquer the specific. My performance continued to degrade. I was becoming a liability. I knew, with the cold, dispassionate logic that was the core of my being, what must be done. I had reached the end of my functional life. The tool was becoming dull. It was time to be discarded. I requested an audience with the ship's captain, a rare and formal proceeding. I made my report, not as Cygnus 9, but as a component of the ship reporting a systems failure. "Captain," my thought was projected with all the formal clarity I could muster. "Astropath Signuris Cygnus 9 is no longer fit for service. The integrity of my transmissions can no longer be guaranteed. I request immediate decommissioning and return to Terra for final dispensation, in accordance with Adeptus Astra Telepathica protocol." The captain, a woman whose great-grandfather had not been born when I first came aboard this ship, received my report with a solemn gravity. My request was not a plea or a confession. It was a technical assessment. She approved it without question. My long watch was over. The journey back to Terra was a quiet one. I was relieved of my duties, placed in a solitary meditation chamber. I was no longer a revered oracle, but a piece of sensitive cargo being returned to its point of origin. I spent the trip in a deep trance, but not one of duty. I allowed the ghost of Kalen to walk freely for the last time. I let the memories come. I did not fight them. I let myself feel the warmth of the sun, the love for my parents, the terror of my awakening, the agony of my transformation. I reviewed the long, sad story of my life, from the beginning to the end. And in doing so, I found a final, strange kind of peace. I had been a prisoner. I had been a tool. But I had also endured. I had served. I had held the line in my own small way, on my own silent, internal battlefield. My life had been a tragedy, but perhaps it had not been without meaning. And so I returned to where I began, in the present moment. I am back on Terra, in a white, silent chamber deep within the hollowed-out rock of the Imperial Palace. My body is ancient and frail, little more than a husk attached to a life support system. The final dispensation has been decided. My power, though my control over it is fading, is still pure and strong. I have been judged worthy of the highest honor. I am to be given to the golden throne. Soon they will come for me. They will wheel my withered form into the sanctum imperialis, into the blinding, soul-shattering presence of the master of mankind. They will connect me to the great machine, and the last vestiges of my consciousness, my soul, my psychic energy, will be rendered down and fed to the undying emperor, a single drop of fuel to keep the great light of the Astronomicon burning for another fraction of a second. This is my end, and I am not afraid. The boy who loved the rain is long dead. The astropath who served for centuries is obsolete. All that is left is this final act of service, this ultimate consumption into the will of the Imperium. I have no self left to fear for, no identity to mourn. I am only an echo, a final thought before the silence. The process of my forging is complete. I was the raw material, I was the tempered tool, and now I am the final, willing sacrifice. I no longer remember the feeling of rain, but I will, in my last moment, become a part of the light that holds back the storm. And in the grim, terrible calculus of this galaxy, that is a kind of victory,